Good afternoon, and thank you for listening to this recording. It appears that I somehow set it up so no one else could get in live, but that's the way it goes. Uh, I am going to talk this afternoon about Pentecost, and the theme that I want to keep in mind is something culture of encounter. Is what I picked up. Culture of encounter. I read that someplace, and I think that's so important. Not the culture of confrontation, but the culture of encounter that is an encounter of communion that somehow communicates with one another, even as there are differences. Record that when God created, God made a lot of different things, a lot of different animals. There were just a lot of different plants and bugs and trees and so on and so forth, stars, and as we know, chemicals and so on and so forth. So God made differences, but he didn't make differences to keep them from connecting. He made differences in a way that they would connect, and they connect through the divine creator. So here we have a great difference. We have we have human beings, if you will, and these human beings are going to be connected with the depth of the divine, which is not human, and that's through the Holy Spirit. And so this is how it transpires. It's Acts chapter 2, verse 1 to 11. And Luke is the author of Acts, we think. And it says, when the day of Pentecost had come, they, that is the disciples, the followers of Jesus, both men and women, were all together in one place. So it was a community of people together in one place. And suddenly, from heaven, there comes a sound, okay? Some kind of a sound. And they're trying to describe the sound. They say that it comes from heaven. In other words, it's not a sound of every day. How do they know what a sound from heaven is like? Well, I think if you have a bit of contemplative life, which from previous talks, I've said they were all together. What were they doing? They were sitting and they had time on their hands because Jesus told them not to go anywhere till they receive the Holy Spirit. So it's a time of being in silence and solitude some. And so they are attuned to some kind of a sound, just as someone who is having a more contemplative life. They would hear what everybody else would call wind and say it's the breath of God. And they suddenly would have a sense of the presence of God in their midst. Well, other people would say it's a windy day. It's the difference. The same thing brings us into contact with the divine that someone else cannot get beyond the rationalization of nature. So it's called this sound that came from heaven. It's like a rush of violent wind. Didn't say it was a violent wind. It says like a rush of violent wind. But let's take that idea of wind. Wind, where do you find a lot of wind? In their lifetime, the desert. The desert is often very windy, although so can the city be. But it's the wind of the desert. Remember, one doesn't have to go too far to get away from civilization and buildings and such back then. And so this wind, what does the desert have? It has wind, it has fire in the sense of lightning. And remember the Exodus. The Exodus happens in the desert. It's the Red Sea. It's things are not going so well because the Pharaoh and his troops are chasing after the Hebrew tribes that had just left Egypt on their exodus to the Promised Land, and they've got wind, they've got a fire that lights up so they can see at night. So the idea is fire and wind is a sense of God's presence. The New Testament is a fulfillment of getting into the Old Testament, okay? So suddenly from heaven there came a sound, like the rush of a violent wind, and it fills the entire house where they were sitting. In other words, there's a sense of, well, first of all, they're sitting. They're sitting at this time. So it's a sense of being at prayer, this kind of sitting there at prayer, and God is coming to them through their prayer. And so it's the breath of God, if you will, as we sit in meditation. And it's filling up everything. It's not just, oh, right here with me. It's everywhere around them. They sense this divine presence. So it is the encounter of God using wind and soon the fire of the tongues to encounter these human beings. And if you wish, God's here and the human beings here, and to kind of bring us to some non-duality, so communion, connectivity, if you will. So now it goes on, divided tongues of fire. Again, back to the desert fire, and the fire of God. Think of what ignites one to get to their truest self is think of it as the match, like a match that ignites something in us, and we become fire. And so it's divided tongues of fire appeared among them. It's all around them, if you will. And the idea is tongues. They're sitting, not saying anything, but through God, they are going to be able to speak in God talk, if you will. They're going to be able to make themselves understood by all kinds of people who see themselves as different by languages. And what's happening here is through the power of God, their differences are brought together. The culture of encounter in communion is a lot of what the spiritual life is about. As we grow in a depth of contemplative practice, we do not see as much the differences as we see the connectivity that goes deeper than what the eye sees. So we begin to see with the heart, which is what they're going to do. So these tongues of fire appear among them, and a tongue rested on each of them. And so it's a sense of warmth. And many have said that when they pray silently and still and let themselves go deeper into their center, their bodies actually warm up. And I have found that. I'll go in and sit in the chapel with cold hands, and suddenly everything warms up. So all of them were filled with the Holy Spirit. There's the culture of connectivity. They're filled with the Holy Spirit, and they begin to speak languages that are not their own personal language, if you will. So it's the gift of communication so that they can be able to speak the truth, that is the truth for everybody, finding a way to use language. So out of the silence of their prayer, out of the silence of waiting, they enter into a season of communication and connectivity and encounter in communion. They are taking on a whole new culture. Remember, these are very tribal people, and they live in a very tribal world. My brother, my sister is my tribe. Outside of my tribe, I don't know what you are. You're something else. You're always something else. But they began to speak in other languages. Each of them have tongues, so there's a certain commonality among them. They speak another language as the Spirit gives them ability. That is, there's always going to be some differences, even in our connectivity. And so some have an ability to do one thing, and some has an ability to do more. So they're sitting open to the Spirit, and the Spirit goes to work right into their hearts, and they are being transformed as communicators. Remember, they were cowards. They were scared. They didn't want to say anything to anybody about anything. So there was a silence of fear. Here is going to become the sound of courage and trust and hope and belief, all coming as this Holy Spirit comes upon them. They could never be changed simply by talking about it. I don't think my sermons or even this talk is going to bring anybody to faith, because words appeal to one's mind. You need, if that's all there is words without the Holy Spirit working on you, they'll appeal to your mind. But faith and a relationship to God goes deeper. It goes to the heart. And so you need the Holy Spirit, the spark of the Spirit, to take you into your depth. And that's where you'll be sparked with faith, the encounter with God, the mystery of God. And then you'll make sense of it with your mind, or as we often say, faith, seeking understanding. Thomas Aquinas and the medieval church, faith, seeking understanding. But first, you got to have a little faith, and that comes from the Holy Spirit. It goes on. Now there were devout Jews from every nation. So they're Jews there because it's a Passover-ish time. It's a feast. No, it's tabernacles. That's what Pentecost is, tabernacles. So there's a lot of people there. Devout Jews from every nation under heaven, which means they may be Jewish, but they're speaking lots of different languages. They may have a common language, but their ordinary everyday language is the language from where they live. And so they're people living in Jerusalem. They're people from every nation under heaven. And so it's the 12 tribes brought together, but even with different languages and different customs, but they're still the 12 Hebrew tribes. And the Spirit is going to break through that to bring about a sense of non-duality. Jesus Christ came into this world to bring people together with the encounter, a culture of encounter. But some people don't want it, so they got rid of them. They don't want a culture of encounter. They want a culture of confrontation. I'm right, you're wrong, and I feel better knowing I'm right. So at the sound, that is, at the sound, for the first time, the disciples are speaking fearlessly. The locked door is opened. So at the sound, the crowd gathered and was bewildered. Even the sound brings people together. That is, the sound of God in our midst brings people together rather than divides them. Well, then what divides people? Talking about God as if we're all different. As if I got my God, you got your God, my God's right, your God is stupid and wrong. That doesn't bring people together. And you have a lot of separations in Christianity. The crowd is gathered, but they're also bewildered. They're gathering it because they can't quite figure this out up here. That's why they're bewildered, because each one hears them speaking in their own language. It's a new phenomenon. So they're amazed, they're astonished. As people were when Jesus healed, they were amazed, they were astonished. So they're amazed, they're astonished, just like the disciples were when they found Jesus raised from the dead. They were amazed and astonished. Didn't say what they believed, but they were amazed and astonished. And it goes on, and not all of these are not all these who are speaking Galileans. In other words, you speak with an accent. It's a bit like a New Yorker, growing up as a New Yorker in the Bronx, and you're learning French. You'll still speak French with Bronx accent. I guarantee it. And how is it that we hear each of us in our own language? So it's not just words that are being spoken, but meaning. God is trying to get meaning across to these people, and the meaning comes through the phenomenon. We're hearing in our own language what they're saying, but the meaning of non-duality is brought about because we can all hear, and they're all speaking in different languages, so that all of us are brought to, the different languages are bringing us together. So God is taking differences and uniting them. This is what Jesus Christ was about, non-duality, and that's what contemplative prayer is about. And they name them Parthians, Medes, and so on and so forth, people from everywhere. And remember the Tower of Babel? Well, if you don't, it's chapter 11 of Genesis. Tower of Babel was where people all spoke the same language, And they said, hey, let's build a tall tower. Let's be like God. And God said, these people are all about themselves. They want to be big, powerful, and strong. He says, let's give them different languages so they don't get all full of themselves and forget about me. So now God is going counter to that and says, okay, enough of the Tower of Babel. Let's for a moment bring people to a sense of the oneness of Jesus Christ for everybody. So they're all speaking in our languages. We hear them speaking about God's deeds of power. Well, this is one of the great deeds of power. In the Old Testament, God can seemingly go on a long time and appear inactive. That's often what you see in the Psalms. Where are you, God? Oh, I'm suffering, but I have faith. I trust God. Oh, please help my untrust, unfaith. And here it is. What most people know is Jesus is dead. Some believe that he's raised. And now the disciples really have it. They've really gotten over their fear because they see the power of God working in them, the same power that raised Jesus from the dead. And I'm just going to look at 1 Corinthians, which was also on 1 Corinthians chapter 12. You can look at the first 13 verses. I just want to look at that quickly for a moment because I think it continues on this idea of non-duality. In the first letter of St. Paul to the Corinthians, chapter 12, verse 3 to 13, more or less. He says, to each is given the manifestation of the Spirit. It's what the disciples got at Pentecost, for the common good. I think it's very important to keep this in mind. I do. In the monastery where I'm living at the moment, or any rectory that I am in, we're not all the same. We aren't. We're brought up in different families with different customs. We may all be speaking English, and we may all say we're priests or whatever, but in a sense, there's a lot of differences just from our background and our life experiences. But each of us, so wanting everybody to act the same and be the same as I am from my cultural background and my family upbringing is ridiculous. Those differences just are. They're fine. God is not about to change those differences. But to each is given the manifestation of the Spirit for the common good. We all have the power of the Spirit. And it's not to make a big deal of us like the Tower of Babel people. It's to remember God is a big deal, and we're all part of God. That's the common good. So the monastery is about a common good, not about a common monk. Monks are all different. They're all approaching God from their own backgrounds. We have certain ways of living, rule of St. Benedict, but still, it's pretty obvious the differences. But there's a common good here to be of support to one another in God exhibiting God's deeds and power through us that others might see it. So it goes on to say, for in the one Spirit we were all baptized. One Spirit, not a spirit, different Spirit for each of us. We're all baptized into one body, non-duality. And he says, Jew or Greek, slave or free. We were all made to drink of the one Spirit. So stop complaining that people aren't just like you, and stop hanging around with people who are only like you, and open yourself to Pentecost experiences of encountering people who are not like you, but encounter them in communion. Find out about them, ask about them, be concerned about them, be open to them instead of trying to convince themselves they are right or wrong. They're not, basically, they're not like you. But that doesn't make them have no spirit. So with that, I hope that you continue to grow as we have come to the end of the Easter season, that you will continue to grow in this culture of encounter in communion. Thank you very much.